Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most complex and, honestly, fiercely debated ideas in legal philosophy, global justice in jurisprudence. If you've ever wondered how the law handles fairness on a planetary scale, well, let's explore the foundational theories together. We're going to meticulously unpack this complex mechanism in detail and see exactly how thinkers have shaped our modern understanding of global rights and responsibilities. Okay. Let's dive into this structural roadmap. We're looking at 1. The global justice question, 2. Justice bound by states, 3. Justice without borders, 4. The pragmatic bridge position, 5. The legal machinery problem, and finally 6. Real-world battlegrounds.
Section 1. The global justice question. Do we owe fairness across borders? So here's the thing. Legal justice fundamentally requires people who owe each other something, and a clear reason why they owe it. So do you owe a stranger on the absolute other side of the planet the exact same fairness you owe your next-door neighbor? Domestically, the reason we owe our neighbors fairness is pretty clear, right? We share a coercive legal system, we pay taxes into the same pot, and we're bound by the same police and laws. But globally, that shared system is missing. Lawyers and philosophers have been fighting over this exact question for 50 years, and how we answer it changes what international law is even for.
To really wrap our heads around this fight, we've got to go all the way back to Aristotle. He split justice into two distinct categories centuries ago. Corrective justice is relatively easy to grasp. If a state wrongs another, they pay reparations to right that specific wrong. Simple enough. But distributive justice asks, who gets what? How do we divide benefits and burdens, like wealth, rights, and opportunities, among a community? The entire global justice debate we're unpacking today is fundamentally a massive fight about distributive justice. Do the principles that decide who gets what within a country apply to the whole human species, especially when there's no global government to actually tax and distribute those resources?
Section 2. Justice bound by states. The statist perspective.
All right, meet our first major camp in the debate, the statists, or particularists. Philosopher Thomas Nagel introduces this concept of the shared coercive institution. Now, what's really interesting about this is how Nagel insists that justice obligations don't just magically float in the air. They only crystallize where citizens share a state. You have to be jointly the authors of the laws and jointly subject to them. Nagel argues that without this shared state, we don't have true justice. What we have instead is merely humanitarian concern, which is much weaker, entirely optional, and legally non-enforceable.
And Nagel definitely isn't alone here. John Rawls, a literal giant in legal and political philosophy, lands right near this camp with his duty of assistance. Domestically, Rawls is famous for his difference principle, this idea that society should be structured so that any economic inequalities must ultimately benefit the absolute worst-off citizens. But globally, he controversially refused to extend that domestic principle to the rest of the world. He severely limited international obligations to this incredibly thin duty of assistance. He argued richer peoples must help burdened societies reach a minimally decent, self-governing baseline, but absolutely nothing more. This specific move is arguably the single most contested point in modern jurisprudence on this topic.
Section 3. Justice without borders. The cosmopolitan rebuttal.
So, on the flip side, cosmopolitans absolutely fiercely reject Rawls's thin duty. They argue justice applies simply because we are all human, regardless of institutions. Thinker Charles Bates takes Rawls's logic and essentially flips it on its head. He argues that global economic interdependence, think global finance, the IMF, the World Bank, already functions as a shared coercive basic structure. When the IMF can essentially dictate the economic policy of a developing nation in exchange for a loan, well, that's a highly coercive institution. Bates's logic is sharp. If shared institutions trigger justice obligations, those massive global institutions already exist today. Therefore, the obligation is already triggered.
Thomas Pogue captures this radical shift perfectly. As you can see, he argues that the existing global institutional order actively harms the global poor, and rich states are complicit. So the crucial point here is Pogue's radical jurisprudential move of completely reframing global poverty. This is no longer a conversation about a lack of charity. It is a direct, stinging accusation of an active, structural injustice.
Let's dive deep into exactly what POG means here. Failing to help implies a positive duty to assist, like giving to charity, but POG focuses on active harm. He argues this is about negative duties, the fundamental legal duty not to cause harm, being actively breached by our current global order. For example, he points to international rules like resource privileges. These rules legally allow any dictator who seizes power by force to turn around and sell a country's oil or minerals on the global market.
The global trade system eagerly buys those resources, enriching the dictator and actively harming the local populations. The global order isn't just ignoring these people. Through its institutions, it's structurally and actively harming them.
And honestly, we literally can't talk about this without bringing up Peter Singer. While he operates slightly more in moral philosophy than strict legal jurisprudence, Singer argues from a utilitarian perspective. He famously posits that if you saw a child drowning in a shallow pond, you would undoubtedly ruin your shoes to jump in and save them. Under his logic, if you can prevent suffering without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, physical distance is entirely morally irrelevant. Whether the child is right in front of you or a continent away, you're fundamentally obligated to act.
Section 4. The pragmatic bridge position. Moving beyond ideal theory. Now, if you're feeling a bit stuck in academic gridlock between statists and cosmopolitans right now, you're not alone. Thinkers like Amartya Sen step in with incredibly practical alternatives to this whole debate. Sen introduces what he calls comparative justice. He argues that jurisprudence has wasted decades chasing a perfect, transcendental blueprint of a completely just world order. Sen says we simply don't need a flawless theory of global justice to recognize and act against a blatantly clear injustice like a famine. His comparative approach means international bodies don't have to wait for philosophers to finish their 50-year debate before they can take immediate, decisive action to relieve human suffering today.
Martha Nussbaum offers another really fascinating bridge with her capabilities approach. She heavily critiques Rawls's reliance on social contract theory. See, a social contract structurally requires roughly equal parties negotiating for mutual advantage. But look at the global stage. A massive economic superpower and a small developing nation are simply not equal parties at a negotiating table. Because the global stage structurally lacks this equality, the traditional contract model structurally fails. This makes a capabilities-based approach where we absolutely must secure health, bodily integrity, and education globally, necessary to ensure basic human dignity.
Section 5. The legal machinery problem. HLA Hart's structural critique.
Let's shift the lens from moral philosophy strictly to legal theory. Philosopher H.L.A. Hart outlined the actual structural mechanics of how law functions. Step 1 is establishing a rule of recognition, a foundational rule like a constitution that lets everyone agree on what a valid law actually is. Step 2 is creating centralized enforcement mechanisms, and this brilliantly illustrates Hart's deep critique. International law struggles to even be called law in the full sense because it completely lacks these two foundational structural steps. There is no ultimate global constitution, and there's certainly no global police force.
Which leaves us staring at a pretty uncomfortable question. If international law's legal status is so structurally shaky, who actually has the authority to enact and enforce global justice? The stark reality is that you could completely win the moral argument. You could conclusively prove to everyone that we owe perfect distributive justice to everyone on Earth. But the physical, legal machinery to actually deliver and enforce it, it simply doesn't exist yet.
Section 6. Real-world battlegrounds, where theory meets reality.
We absolutely need to connect these abstract theories to reality, proving this isn't just academic hair-splitting. Let's systematically map this out. The statist focus perfectly describes IMF conditionality. When the IMF gives loans to developing nations, they demand strict internal policy changes, treating the state as an isolated unit responsible for its own borders. Conversely, cosmopolitans attack WTO trade rules. They argue these rules are structurally designed to privilege wealthy nations' patents and agricultural subsidies, actively harming developing economies, exactly like Pogge warned. And the pragmatic bridge approach? We saw this vividly during global vaccine distribution. International bodies largely abandoned debates over perfect legal frameworks to focus on addressing the immediate, comparative injustice of unequal vaccine access right in front of us.
Now, I want to be super clear here. There is no single winner in jurisprudence, and we aren't taking political sides. The immense strength of understanding this explainer is realizing exactly why incredibly smart people profoundly disagree. This unresolved fight between the statists, the cosmopolitans, the pragmatists, and the structuralists isn't a failure of philosophy. This very debate defines what international law is ultimately for and what its exact limits are.
So I want to leave you with a question to chew on today. When you look at the rules governing global vaccine distribution today, or international climate treaties, or global trade, which philosophical camp's logic do you think is actually winning in reality? Think about that the next time you read the global news. You've now got the jurisprudential lens to see the hidden machinery behind the headlines. Thanks for exploring this explainer with me today.